Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the Sunday Stream. I hope that you are all having a fantastic Sunday, whether it is morning, evening, or afternoon. Things have finally changed weather-wise around here. For the first time, it is not, according to my little temperature thing here, it is only 80 degrees. So this is like a nice, calm fall break for us in Texas, where it's not been triple digits in the Fahrenheit, of course. So at least that's been my calm reprieve from everything. So I hope that you're all doing well. And today we're going to be doing a little more of some reading, but also taking a look at some concepts such as diversionary foreign policy and a book that I had read back in high school, one of those books that had inspired me really to be really interested in geopolitical things. So we're going to be doing a little bit of that as well. So without much further ado, I'll just give you an outline of what we're doing today. There's no PowerPoint presentation for this one, so it should be about an hour talk or so lecture with some readings, and we'll get from there on to some big announcements. So today's discussion and lecture is going to be around a recent article from Richard Haass. He is the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, and I can already tell as soon as I say that word, there are some red flags or alarm bells ringing in the back of your heads. Do not worry. I'm not going to be in full endorsement of anything that he's saying. If you want to hear some rather important opinions or pieces from the Council of Foreign Relations, I would suggest that you go watch Keith Woods' video on the history of the CFR before going any further. However, the article that he brought up called The Dangerous Decade, which I have linked below in an archive link for you to read, but don't worry, we'll have it up on screen, talks about some of the more important issues. And one of the biggest things that Richard Haass has been focusing on throughout most of his career since he left the George W. Bush administration, which is the emphasis that foreign policy does begin at home. In fact, in 2013, he wrote a whole book on it, which I own a physical copy of, but thankfully you all will get to read the digital LibGen version, which I've downloaded online. Now, this book, alongside George Friedman's The Next 100 Years, which was published in 2009, had a 2011 update, which I own. Those were the two big books that really inspired me to look inwardly about foreign affairs and foreign relations. Also, keep in mind that he's not the first person to say this. There's a great passage in, I want to say, Volume 2 of Decline of the West that discusses this, primarily from the Roman account, in which the conduct of a nation state at home is the conduct it will conduct to all nations abroad. So this isn't anything new, but I think that it is important in these rather interesting times that we live in. Not to say that any previous era hasn't been interesting, but for us, we live in the present. So we'll start with that. We'll go towards his book, talk about diversionary foreign policy, and then get into your questions, super chats, and what have you. There's also a Buy Me a Coffee link down below. You can leave little messages there. I will easily respond to those as well. For those of you who do not like donating to YouTube, I totally understand. And once my setup changes, which I plan to have changed soon, we'll have Entropy and OBS up as well. But without further ado, we're going to add the article to stream now. There you go. I'm going to go put myself down here in a corner, and we'll get started. So this is out for the September-October edition of Foreign Affairs magazine called The Dangerous Decade, a Foreign Policy for a World in Crisis. And I don't think Richard Haass needs too much of an introduction, but if you do need one, we can give you a short one with that in mind. So Richard Haass is the president of the Council of Foreign Relations, but prior to that, as I mentioned, he worked in the Bush administration. Now, this isn't I know that probably raises some bells when it comes to the issue of what he's done in his career, but I'll just give you a brief rundown. So he's assumed the office since 2003, which kind of tells you quite a bit of what's going on. Prior to that, though, he was the director of policy planning for the United States Department of State and a close advisor to Secretary of State then Colin Powell in the George W. Bush administration. Richard Haass, if you remember that phrase, director of policy planning, keep in mind that the very first individual to hold that office and created that office was George F. Kennan, which we've covered in a 3-part series before. And so he was succeeded, of course, by Mitchell Reese later in 2000. Well, he's also the special envoy, of course, to Northern Ireland as well during that time frame. And he's held a variety of other positions, but he is primarily, of course, the Council of Foreign Relations president. He, he thinks of himself as one that doesn't buy into the liberal framework of, say, Francis Fukuyama or the end of history. And in fact, when we'll go into his text in 2013, we'll talk about quite a bit of that. Educated in Oberlin College and quite a few other places. He is, again, one of those other interesting characters, the nose knows, if you know what I mean. But we'll get started with the article. So, The Dangerous Decade, A Foreign Policy for a World in Crisis by Richard Haass. And here we go. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. Those words apocryphally are attributed to Bolshevik revolutionary and foreign affairs reader Vladimir Lenin, referring to the rapid collapse of Tsarist Russia just over 100 years ago. If he had actually said those words, Lenin might have also added that there are also decades where centuries happen. The world is in the midst of one such decade. As with other historical hinges, the dangers today stems from a sharp decline in the world order, but more than any other recent moment, that declines threaten to become especially steep owing to the confluence of old and new threats that have begun to intersect at a moment where the United States is ill-positioned to contend with them. On one hand, the world is witnessing the revival of some of the worst aspects of traditional geopolitics: great power competition, imperial ambitions, fights over resources, and this is where we're going to get his more political bindings here to the regime. Russia is headed by a tyrant, President Vladimir Putin, who longs to recreate a Russian sphere of influence and perhaps even a Russian empire. Putin is willing to do almost anything to achieve his goal and is able to act as he pleases because internal constraints on his regime have mostly disappeared. Meanwhile, under President Xi Jinping, China has embarked on a quest for regional and potentially global primacy, putting itself in a trajectory that has increased competition or even confrontation with the United States. Richard Haass has recognized that this isn't an era of unipolarity. However, he doesn't share the realist bend that that world order that we've traditionally seen, the quote-unquote Pax Americana, is something that isn't negative in the consequences on global affairs. He continues, saying, but this is not all, not by a long shot. These geopolitical risks are colliding with the complex new challenges central to the contemporary era. Again, more of the regime talking points of climate change, pandemics, and nuclear proliferation. The third one we're actually going to start talking about in depth in the future. I recently purchased a very hefty tome on nuclear weapons policy. And surprisingly, the diplomatic fallout from growing rivalries has made it nearly impossible for great powers to work together on regional and international challenges, even when it is in their interest to do so. Now, we're going to get to the part here that I think is the most important part to discuss. Further complicating the picture is the reality that American democracy and political cohesion are at a risk to a degree not seen since the middle of the 19th century. This matters because the United States is not just one country among many. U.S. leadership has underpinned what order there has been in the world for the past 75 years and remains no less central today. A United States riven internally, however, will become ever less willing to and able to lead on the international stage. These conditions have set off a vicious cycle. Heightened geopolitical competition makes it even more difficult to produce cooperation demanded by global problems, and the deteriorating international environment further fuels geopolitical tensions, all at a time that the United States is weakened and distracted. The frightening gap between global challenges and the world's responses, and the increased prospects for major power wars in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and the growing potential for Iran to cause instability in the Middle East, have come together to produce the most dangerous moment since World War II. Call it a perfect, or more accurately, an imperfect storm. Now, this is the area that I do want to focus on today, is the area in which the internal politics do determine the outset of it all. And this is why I want to talk about diversionary foreign policy. Diversionary foreign policy is the concept in which, a term that identifies usually a war instigated by a country's leader in order to distract its population from their own domestic strife. This concept is typically illustrated by domestic war theory or rally around the flag syndrome. It's primarily also just seen, not just in the idea of instigating a war, although we see that happen quite a bit. It is also the diversionary foreign policy of when things seem bad at home, the president of the United States typically goes abroad. This has been the case more or less since the Second World War in the United States. There has not been, prior to the First World War in 1914, and once America had entered in 1917, there had not been a significant amount of international travel by heads of state from the United States, primarily its president, or its senior officials in either the House of Representatives or the United States Senate. Typically, often we would see historically the Secretary of State or specific envoys and those in the diplomatic corps take those positions abroad. However, since the end of the Second World War and by extension the Cold War, that has changed. Diversionary foreign policy does mean that despite issues at home and its domestic projects, war or the likelihood of creating international tensions to divert ourselves from the attention of these issues can be seen quite clearly. For the United States and those in Europe, many of our economic troubles started long before this conflict began in February of this year. This would include inflation, gas and energy prices, supply chain issues, a lot of that instigated by currently what had started at the beginning of 2020 with COVID. And with that being said, a lot of the focus on the international provides a nice and easy distraction, dare say diversion, from what we're currently dealing with right now. You can see this quite often when it comes to the claims of Putin's price hike and other things like that, in order to ensure that the issues that have been long-standing in the country now have a diversion or a foreign straw man to do so. Now, this is not to say that the ongoing war in Ukraine has not caused significant issues in regards to energy. We know this both from the sanctions regime and the declarations of force majeure on various pipelines, especially Nord Stream 1. So, it is, again, not entirely diversionary, but it certainly plays a significant factor for politicians at home, which also serves as a convenient way, of course, to roll in all those god-awful other policies. Funny how solving the issues of climate change and pollution can only be solved by more taxation and global governance. But I mean, historically, this isn't just an American phenomenon. I do know, for example, in 1905, during the Russo-Japanese War, what was said, I think by I want to say the Russian Minister of War or the Interior, he had said something along the lines of what the country needs is a short war with a victory to stem the tide of revolution. Because again, keep in mind, 1905 is just shortly before 1917. And of course, liberation of the serfs, Czarist Russia was not doing a favor to itself, not only by losing in 1905, but its internal reforms at home. Distractions, of course, can either levy themselves if you have the international capability to do so. And that requires typically for you to be industrialized, strong economically, strategically, and politically, and to have the political capital to do so. Nowadays, presidents go abroad in the United States primarily because they do not have the political capital at home, and garnering up a rhetorical, moral, or actual political victory abroad is a great way to reset the momentum and the game at home. But with that being said, we'll continue on with our reading. To warn of danger is not to predict the future. Ideally, things will turn out for the better, ideally. But good things rarely happen on their own, and contrary, left to their own devices, systems deteriorate. That's very true. The task for U.S. policymakers, then, is to rediscover the principles and practice of statecraft, to marshal national power and collective action against the tendency towards disorder. The goal must be to manage the collision of old geopolitics and new challenges, to act with discipline in what is sought, and to build arrangements, or better yet, institutions where there is sufficient consensus. To do all that, Washington will have to prioritize establishing order over fostering democracy abroad, at the same time as it works to shore up democracy at home. I'm reading this article in part not just because I want you to listen to what the establishment has to say. You should be listening to that. What's surprising that I think in this discourse about the United States, or the USG, I should really say more so, is that the USG publishes almost everything that it does. When you really should start being concerned is when the American government stops publishing things. We publish virtually everything from where U.S. naval carrier fleet deployments are to what the Congressional Research Service has to say about the status of our nuclear weapons. You can even get our nuclear policy review that comes out every new administration in the White House, or at least every 4 years. So, I mean, when we stop publishing things like how many arms are we sending abroad or how many arms shipments are we tracking, and a record of our armament deals, which has recently happened in the United States, then there's a reason for concern. But this focus, he says at the very end, to prioritize establishing order over fostering democracy abroad, you're going to see that this has been his long-standing thesis since 2013, and it's not a bad thesis to establish the domestic house before you go abroad, almost as if Peterson was telling the USG to clean their rooms before you start talking to everybody else. However, the solutions that he offered in 2013 and the solutions and discussions that he offers here are rather an anathema of some of the problems that we have here. But the resounding thesis is not too bad. Order on the rise. So you'll see this again when we talk about his book in 2013. In August 1990, intent on territorial conquest, again, this is his narrative, not mine, Iraq invaded its far smaller neighbor of Kuwait. This will not stand. U.S. President George H.W. Bush responded, and he was right. Within weeks, Washington had organized a wide-ranging international support for military intervention around the limited objective of rejecting Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The 1990-91 Gulf War was marked by extensive cooperation, including from China and Russia, fostered by U.S. leadership under the aegis of the United Nations. In a matter of months, a coordinated response met considerable success. Iraqi aggression was reversed and Kuwait's independence restored at a minimal cost. The major powers upheld the norm that force can not be used to change borders, a fundamental element of the international order. Things have certainly changed since 1991. Nothing of that sort could take place today, as the Ukraine crisis has made abundantly clear, and the fact that Russia is a much more powerful, influential country than Iraq was in 1990 only partly explains the difference. Well, the other difference, I would say, is nuclear weapons. Although Russia's invasion has inspired a sense of solidarity and impressive levels of coordination amongst Western countries, the war in Ukraine has yielded nothing resembling the nearly universal embrace of goals and institutions of a US-led order that was spurred by the Gulf War. Instead, Beijing has aligned itself with Moscow, and much of the world has refused to sign on to sanctions imposed on Russia by Washington and its partners. Again, this is a long-standing narrative that we've seen. We saw this with the United Nations General Assembly vote on condemning Russia. I always tell people to pay attention to the 35 countries that had abstained, primarily around India, South Africa, and of course China. So, in this sense, the two wars serve as bookends to the post-Cold War Pax Americana. The United States' preponderance of power was bound to diminish, not owing to American decline, but because of what commentator Fareed Zakaria dubbed the rise of the rest. That is, the economic and military development of other countries and entities, and the emergence of a world defined by a much greater diffusion of power. That said, the United States, by what it did and did not do in the world and at home, squandered much of its post-Cold War inheritance, failing to translate its primacy into an enduring order. Well, primarily because much of our political capital was spent in response to what happened 21 years ago today. Also, on that note, Fareed Zakaria's Rise of the Rest is actually not a bad is actually a pretty good argument, as he makes. More or less the argumentation, as it says here in the article, that the rest of the, not just the Western world, but what we would traditionally call the Third World, Eastern powers, Asiatic powers, will inevitably take advantage of increased trade liberalization, spread of technology and ideas, and modernize, and by an extent, industrialize its military very quickly. However, he says not owing to American decline. This is where I would significantly disagree with Mr. Haas. We must refer back to our good friend Samuel P. Huntington. If you are a longtime viewer of the channel, you'll know that we reviewed his book on the channel, The Clash of Civilizations, and also that Samuel P. Huntington was the teacher and mentor to Francis Fukuyama. And that book was partially written in response to The End of History and The Last Man. The Clash of Civilizations, however, does put more focus on the civilizational and ideological aspects of regions, not so much ethnicity or race, which he actually was criticized by his cohorts at the time. But he does have an excellent chapter in that book. I want to say it's around chapter 6 or 5, where he talks about that the preponderance of American decline will continue to because the American state, i.e. the U.S. government, is continually ceding more and more of its sovereignty to external powers inside the United States, primarily corporations, special interests groups, the media. Therefore, the United States government cannot coherently make a clear message. It cannot marshal the strength to rally around the flag. of course, with the exception that he notes to existential threats. And of course, knowing how public opinion is easily modified and changed, by all means, read Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann. Skeptical Waves has it on his book. We've talked about it before on this channel. That most of the public opinion, of course, is going to be guided by so called experts, the rise of credentialism, technocracy in its original form back in the 1920s. Individuals who do try their best to read up on things, and he is very correct about this. Lippmann states we live in our own forms of pseudo realities. In term where we don't have the fullest picture, but rather sort of a through the looking glass version of it. Richard Haass, being the Council of Foreign Relations, working well closely with a neoconservative foreign policy government under George W. Bush, and has advocated for a more Atlantic-based, rules-based international system. He lives in his own pseudo-reality, one in which he is finally beginning to look at and offer some intense criticism, both in this text, but also in his 2013 book. This failure is especially noticeable when it comes to Russia in the years immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The juxtaposition of vast American power and staggering Russian weakness made it seem unlikely that 3 decades later, world affairs would once again be dominated by the hostility between Kremlin and Western capitals. Debates rage as to how this came to pass, with profound disagreements on how much blame the United States deserves and how much should be attributed to Putin or the Russian political culture more broadly. But whatever the cause, it is difficult to deny that 6 U.S. presidential administrations have little to show for all their efforts to successfully build a post-Cold War relationship with Russia, in part due to the fact that it's been more or less the ongoing policy of the last 6 administrations to not foster any kind of well-meaning diplomatic policy, whether it would be the interventions, sanctions, or the ongoing expansion of NATO. Those are not the only arguments I think that are kept in mind, but also failure to acknowledge the political culture in Russia as well. I think that as our experience dealing with George F. Kennan has been noted in the last few streams over the last month or two, it is indicative that there are there are a few Western leaders, diplomats, and others that work within the Foreign Department that have a very firm understanding of the Russian political culture or what's inside it. This is partially why I've not covered the war day-to-day or the Russian side of things, is because I would not even begin to tell you what the Russian perspective is, both politically or spiritually on these matters. I get to see it from a lot of Russian subscribers and those that live in the area, and even their opinions may vary. But we'll continue on. Let's see here. I've read this article before, and if you've already read it, by all means, I do apologize, but there are a few parts that I think are very important. Russia's aggression has upended many assumptions that have influenced the thinking about international relations in the post-Cold War era. It certainly has. It has ended the holiday from history in which wars between countries were rare. It has hollowed out the norm against countries acquiring territory by force, and has demonstrated that the economic interdependence is no bulwark against threats to the world order. Many believed that Russia's reliance on Western European markets for its energy exports would encourage restraint. In reality, such ties did no better in moderating Russian behavior as they did in preventing the outbreak of the First World War. And this is why we've talked about on this channel before that economic interdependence is typically a very bad indicator of how things will go. There are liberals that will tell you that it's a great way to enforce peace. This is where you do get sort of that democratic liberal market peace theory that we've seen that get thoroughly debunked in some places, others not so much. But that requires a much more neo-functionalist lens, which we've also talked about with how the EU operates. And others, more like the realists, will tell you that actually it's an escalating aspect that one can hold leverage over the other. And if you don't effectively communicate what you're planning to do with that trade partner or sanctions, then you leave the likelihood of conflict and escalation to be on the table. The book I always tell people to read is Dale C. Copeland's Economic Interdependence in War. It's a relatively short read. I think it's about 200 pages or less. I think it's 216. And he talks about the importance of trade expectation. The idea that we need to be careful of how our expectations of trade are viewed by our partners. If we think that our trade expectations between nation states are likely to continue to go the way that they are, then the likelihood of conflict is to be lessened. However, if we think that our trade expectations are to deteriorate based upon recent actions by nation states and governments, then the likelihood for escalation and conflict remains on the table. And in fact, this trade expectation theory is being tested out right now with the war in Ukraine. We see this right now primarily over pipelines. We see this over the current issues over energy and utility costs inside Western Europe, and the declaration of force majeure in places like Nord Stream 1. Some of this may be by the nature of Western sanctions. Some of this may be by the decision of the Russian government to provide economic stranglehold over Western energy markets to a point now where the European Union is buying Russian gas from China at elevated above market prices. And so, by extension, the expectation of trade does give us a pretty good indicator of where things might go in escalation. The question really then becomes who blinks? But, here we go. Uh, Unlike the Soviet Union, Russia is anything but a superpower. Even before Western countries imposed sanctions on Russia in response to its assault on Ukraine, the Russian economy was not among the 10 largest in the world in terms of GDP. At least in part because of those sanctions, it is expected to contract up by 10% over the course of 2022. Russia's economy remains heavily dependent on energy production. Its armed forces have revealed themselves to be poorly led and organized and no match for NATO. Again, however, Russia's weakness is juxtaposed against Putin's willingness and ability to act recklessly with its military and nuclear strength he possesses that makes Russia such a danger. The one point I would add here on GDP is that at no point in time during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was there ever GDP parity between the two superpowers. At a solid rate, as Barry Posen tells us in Restraint, a case for a new grand strategy in the United States, that at no point in time in the Cold War did the ratio of GDP from the United States to the Soviet Union it stayed around 2-to-1 ratio. And as our friends Radical Liberation and Ryan Turnipseed has mentioned, GDP is also not the world's clearest indicator of a state's power, its ability to project economically, especially that for nuclear-armed states as well. Pakistan, for instance, does not have itself ranked in the 20th, or I don't think it's ranked in the 20th largest economies, but it is one of the several nations on Earth that possess nuclear weapons. And this is the important thing that I think comes into mind when we take a look at this. You cannot rely as GDP as the sole factor. You have to look at other trade relationships that they have in here. How well have they managed to blanket themselves against sanctions? And additionally, how well is their relationships to other larger economies on Earth? Again, go back to those 35 nations that have voted to abstain in the General Assembly vote to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That being specifically nations like India or South Africa that do rely heavily on manufactured goods, refined gas, and petroleum products. And in the same way that currently right now, India is enjoying a rather stable and healthy relationship at buying Russian gas and oil at a significantly reduced price in an effort, of course, because India has not signed on to the sanctions regime, nor has it opted to join the United States and other Western nations in regards to price caps. So I think there's a little more here down towards the bottom that I want to get to, which is more of the focus at here at home. At least by home, I mean here in the United States. As the geopolitical picture amongst great powers has darkened, a chasm has opened between global challenges and the machinery that is meant to contend with them. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the limitations of the World Health Organizations and the unwillingness or inability of even rich, developed countries to respond to a crisis that they themselves had every reasons to anticipate. 15 to 18 million people have died thus far as a result, millions of them unnecessarily. After nearly 3 years after the pandemic began, China's refusal to cooperate with an independent investigation means the world still does not know how the virus originated and originally spread, making it harder to prevent the next outbreak. Spoiler alert, maybe don't fund sub-BSL-4 laboratories in the Wuhan Virology Institute. But that might get me in trouble with Susan. But still, I do think that the theory from what we've been funding, and of course, going around administration's decrees during the Trump administration to continue to fund gain-of-function research, indicates that the House at home does not have the capability to conduct itself abroad when the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, especially when it comes to a so-called pluralistic democratic system. It tends not to work. But I'll get down closer towards the end here because he's focusing a lot on the issues of Iran and Syria, Russia, and China. Again, he's ringing very similar bells that he talked about in 2013, and we'll get to that book shortly. But again, here's the other issues that I want to deal with. The trouble at home. As problems new and old collide to be combined, combine challenge to the U.S.-led order, perhaps the most worrisome changes are taking place inside the United States itself. The country retains many strengths, but some of its advantages, the rule of law, orderly transitions of power, and the ability to attract and retain talented immigrants on a large scale. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about this in his book. Socioeconomic mobility are now less certain than they once were, and problems such as gun violence, crime in urban areas, drug abuse, and illegal immigration have become far more pronounced. In addition, the country is held back by its political divisions, a widespread refusal amongst Republicans to accept the 2020 election results for the president, yours truly, which led, of course, to the issues on January 6th, which they're now claiming to be the American version of Northern Ireland's The Troubles. I'll believe that when there are more, things happening to cars. Recent Supreme Court decisions and diverging domestic reactions to them have reinforced the impression of a disunited States of America. You don't say. As a result, the American political model has become less appealing, and democratic backsliding in the United States has contributed to backsliding elsewhere. Making matters worse, the U.S. economic mismanagement that led to the 2008 global financial crisis and even more recent missteps have allowed inflation to skyrocket, further damaging the country's reputation. Perhaps most worrisome is the erosion of faith in Washington's basic steadiness. Without a consensus amongst Americans on the country's proper role in the world, there will be a wild swing in U.S. foreign policy, from George W. Bush's administrations to catastrophic overreach in Iraq, to the Obama administration's debilitating underreach in the Middle East and elsewhere, to the Trump administration's incompetence and transactionalism, which has led many to doubt if the president or standing commitments mattered to anyone anymore in Washington. If you recall, when Trump was elected, this was really on stand a lot, where many were thinking, well, what to do with the United States, Angela Merkel especially, with many, of course, within the establishment reassuring Angela Merkel, do not worry, he will only be there for 4 years, 8 at best. Really makes you think. But it does illustrate, of course, however, that the USG doesn't really have the capability to act on consensus, especially when that consensus is being challenged at home. And this is the areas in which we're going to focus about both in this article, but also in his 2013 book, and then focus a little more on diversionary issues. The reason why I wanted to talk about diversionary issues to begin with is the fact that you can focus on abroad as much as you'd like, but when places like Jackson, Mississippi are dealing with an intense water problem, there are rolling blackouts in California, or at least there were earlier the other week. And there are questions over even where I live in Texas, if it can hold up its own electrical grid in the midst of scorching summers and now 2 years in a row of winter freezes. It certainly begs the question as to how well can a nation at home conduct itself abroad. And this is on top of the fact of growing attacks of ransomware, both from state-affiliated actors and others that are simply random hacker groups. How well we can determine that to be the case is still unknown, at least from my perspective. I don't have enough research to tell you honestly which ones are associated with the USG, which are associated with other parties, which are just independent actors. But it does illustrate that things at home are not well. And I think that anyone from an outsider, especially my more European audience, can probably look at the ongoing struggles here in the United States and realize that whatever we have our issues culturally at home, they are exported abroad. This is why Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was talking about the importance of the progress flag in June, that god-awful gay pride flag that has the extra striped triangle in the circle in the middle. I guess they're opening themselves up for more sodomy-laden policy. I don't know. But it does illustrate to me that whatever happens, at home inevitably is exported abroad. The Biden administration has done much to prioritize alliances and partnerships, but it too, at times, has reinforced doubts about American steadfastness and competence, especially during the chaotic withdrawal from U.S. forces of Afghanistan last year, which we've talked about on the stream before. There's a whole playlist of the Sunday streams that will be further updated and added to upon each episode. The fact is that it is impossible to predict who will occupy the Oval Office in the future is nothing new. What is new is that it is impossible to assume much about how that person will approach the United States' relationship with the world. The result is that U.S. allies and partners have increasingly no choice but to weigh continued reliance on Washington against other alternatives, such as greater self-sufficiency or deterrence to powerful neighbors. An additional risk is that Washington's ability to deter rivals will diminish as its foes come to see the United States as too divided and too reluctant to act. And now that part is innately true. The United States in the past has taken advantage of political divisions at home. Keep in mind that the Obama administration, during his second term, did quite a bit to try and oust Benjamin Netanyahu. He had political operatives inside Israel during those elections. Did not attain any success, but it is illustrative of the fact that that can happen. And because things are going to happen with much more discontent and a sense of being disunited and disjointed and almost, dare I say, schizophrenic in our news and how we relate to one another, as we all seem to consume our own forms of media, all live in our own pseudo-realities, as Lippmann points out, that it will be very easy to take advantage of things. This is why I like to refer to people to Charlemagne's Substack article from last year about Afghanistan, that as much as that you may joy about the fact that the war came to an end or that perhaps the USG took some kind of resounding humiliation, that is not your victory. That is someone else's. Don't attach yourself to it, because that means that you can easily paint a target on your back by the regime. And we're going to see this continue ad nauseum, especially when it comes to the administration in regards to the relationship to Russia. We saw this all the time during the Trump administration. We're going to continue to see it ad infinitum as long as this conflict continues, and much longer afterwards. The same will be said about China and other places. And at the same time, America's current political model of liberalism, or some kind of form of that exists therein, is easily taken advantage of by elites from other countries and political operatives by other countries. One needs to look no further than Confucius centers in the United States and other Western colleges and universities, or literally colleges like Stanford University, asking the United States Congress to not investigate them for treason and espionage, despite the fact that more and more college professors keep getting arrested for treason and espionage in dealing with the Chinese. Currently, right now, this does illustrate a sign of clear and present decline. But as we get towards the end of this article here, his one big idea, this portion is about sort of the future, where to go from here. In the face of geopolitical tumult and global challenges that seem certain to define this decade, no overarching doctrine or construct for American foreign policy will be able to play the role that containment did for the Cold War. When the concept provided a great deal of clarity and consensus, such constructs are useful for guiding policymakers, explaining policies to the public, and reassuring allies and signaling adversaries. But the contemporary world does not lend itself to such a simple frame. Spoiler alert, it's never been that simple. Today, there are simply too many challenges of different sorts that do not sit inside a single construct. Can't blame everything on global communism these days. There are plenty of things that have been at-home generated problems that have created even greater crises for the USG abroad, and by extension, everyone else. Accounting for this judgment is the reality that it is no longer possible to speak of a world order as a single phenomenon. There is a traditional geopolitical order reflecting balances of power and to the extent to which norms are shared, and there is what one might term the globalization order, reflecting the breadth and depth of common effort to meet challenges such as climate change and pandemics. World order, or the lack of it, is increasingly the sum of the two. That does not mean that the United States should simply wing it and approach every foreign policy issue in isolation. No, that would be acting without a grand strategy, which we know is foolish. Every nation state has one, primarily oriented around its continued existence, hegemony, and supremacy. We've talked about this before, whether covering the monk debates or Mearsheimer's own concept of realism, or even defensive realism as well. But however, he really focuses primarily from here. The primary threats to the global order are the issues against dealing with Russia and Ukraine, although I would be rather more adamant to focus on more issues at home, which he tries to. But again, issues that he talks about in the rest of this article are focusing on the four big areas, which of course is going to be China, Russia, Iran, and partially Syria. But I'm going to close up on the article here, and I'm going to share a different text as well. Now that we're getting close to the end here, I want to stop screen. Hello, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Yeah, it is certainly a shitty timeline, isn't it? We didn't roll the dice on the good ones, didn't we, folks? But neither here nor there. I'm now going to open this up to his text from 2013. So this is see page 78. We'll get there right back in a second. We'll start at the top. So for those of you who've not read this text, I will upload this on a mega upload link if you'd like to read it. It's only like 200 pages long. He wrote this in 2013. Foreign policy begins at home. The case for putting America's house in order. Shortly after Obama had ran and was reelected in 2012. At the time that this was published, this was considered to be a book that anyone should be reading if they want to run for president in 2016. Lo and behold, this didn't really get read by the right, and with good reason. But I want to start with the return of history. We'll read a little few sections from here because I think that they're rather relevant. Because despite the fact that Richard Haass stands for the more Atlantic-based, US-based led world order that he's been a part of, either with the Council of Foreign Relations now for almost 20 years, but also his time in the Bush administration and acting as a diplomat and envoy to Northern Ireland, there are a few key passages here that really do come to mind. So I'm going to start with this. More than 2 decades later, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, such optimism is mostly gone. The post-Cold War era has been turbulent. It began with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, a classic case of state-on-state aggression that might never have happened during the Cold War, if only because the Soviet Union, Iraq's principal patron at the time, would not have permitted it, lest the United States gave an opening to dispatch military forces to the critical region. This was followed by a series of civil wars and mostly internal crises in countries such as Somalia, the former Yugoslavia, and Rwanda. Humanitarian intervention, where and how to do it, seized the center stage. The attacks on September 11th, 2001 were a shock that graphically demonstrated American vulnerability. Soon after came 2 costly, inconclusive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that have made many Americans skeptical of international involvement, and the question of whether the American military advantages could be translated into lasting gains that would justify the larger and expected costs. The hope for peace dividend never materialized. Still hasn't, by the way. At the same time, America's economic situation has sharply deteriorated as a result of the massive domestic spending and steadily growing entitlements. Man, this is sounding like Jack Kemp. Sharply higher defense outlays and increased interest on the debt. The gross federal debt increased from $3.5 trillion to the end of the Cold War to some $16 trillion, approximately the size of the U.S. economy in a single year by 2012. That number is almost $24 trillion now as of 2022. The financial crisis of September 2008 provoked debates as to whether modern societies were able to effectively administer their own economies. Suddenly, the Washington Consensus and its preferences for market-led economic development was out of fashion, replaced more and more by a model found in many Asian countries that emphasized a stronger role for the state. Protests throughout Europe and inaction by the U.S. in the face of enormous and mounting debt raised and related the issue of whether today's democracies can make it through tough choices to prevent special interests from continuing to overwhelm the collective national interest. Man, this feels like a different era, doesn't it, ladies and gentlemen, from 2013? But just in this short little reading here, you can kind of tell that not too much has changed in his thinking, and that the challenges that he does raise here are still rather relevant. How well can a nation at home govern itself in an increasingly disunited, disjointed, and dare I say schizophrenic fashion with its foreign policy, as well as its domestic policy, and continue to be seen as a global power at home? The answer to that question is that it can't be for very long. However, domestic disputes at home have always been a point of reference from foreign powers to point out to the other. Throughout the Soviet Union, mind you, the issues of civil rights and the issues of race relations in America were always a discussed and propagandistic tool to sort of flex on the United States' position of human rights and liberal democracy. And even to this day, you're beginning to see that now from the Chinese as well. Whatever America's culture war is at home, it will always be taken advantage of and exploited for domestic purposes in regards to rallying around the flag by other countries abroad. But again, more of the sort of liberal narrative comes to mind as well in regards to early 2011 with Tunisia, Egypt, and elsewhere in the Middle East in regards to the Arab Spring. But these upheavals, of course, did not come the way that they did. Now, keep in mind, this was 2013. This was after Libya. So this comes to the point here. In regards to the sort of cycle of history that we see, especially with international relations, um, I think of Polybius' cycle of governance and how, tyranny and Caesarism comes to rise, something which Oswald Spengler wrote about, of course, famously in Decline of the West. Um, and there's a video that I'll probably post in the community tab to share for you all that does a really good outline of that. But he says here that the 21st century is no exception to this pattern. Numerous forces, including economic interdependence, modern conflict between developed countries has the potential to do so and destructive and costly that few differences justify the recourse to war. Regional and global frameworks and organizations set rules, resolve at least some disputes, and offer a venue for consultations and negotiations on issues ranging from trade to arms control. There is as well the willingness and ability of responsible governance to threaten or employ the physical force and other forms of pressure, such as sanctions, to prevent or discourage others from violating established rules of order. Now, he is speaking, of course, from the rules-based system that we have, wherein institutions or nation-states that establish these such global institutions, whether it be the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the NATO, etc., that they set the rules and we must abide by it. And of course, those rules can only really be abided by if there is force to back it up. However, as Fareed Zakaria points out, the rise of the rest, that idea of a rules-based system can be challenged, especially by those that seek hegemony. This is the basic tenet of realism. This is that having one global hegemon is virtually impossible, and those that try to defend it will inevitably sack themselves. And what I mean by that is, for instance, one global empire, one global hegemon will not manage to keep itself going, for instance. This is why you've seen increasingly in the effort to keep things contained in an economic and political sphere of a rules-based order, you have witnessed alternatives come up that wish to challenge that. We can see that most famously with the first nation trading status between, say, the United States and the rest of the world compared to China from 1980 to 2018, where it's virtually shifted, where most nations' primary trading partner was the United States to where now it's the Chinese. And at the same time, it also comes with the issue of demography. That in a pursuit, of course, of this globalized techno-capital that we sort of live in, liberal democracies tend to accelerate themselves towards what has famously been labeled zombie apocalypse and IQ shredders, as by those of Nick Land and Spandrel, by prioritizing higher and higher levels of immigration and higher levels of more concentrated financialization, make work jobs, more men and women working in the workplace. There's less room for family formation, more room for immigration, and that's by chance where you get ridiculous articles such as that was found in the National Interest about 3 weeks ago, discussing the idea that America's military problems could be solved by simply drafting foreigners under the promise of citizenship. Now that is some late stage empire shit, if I don't know any way else to describe it, and pardon me for swearing. But that's the level of ridiculousness that we finally have come to here in the West. Or at least in the United States, I should say. Let me not speak for the rest of the West. But, a bit of primacy that's coming on, the rise of China. This is a very good book. I really do recommend that you read it, at least just to get an idea of the thesis that Haas puts out, not necessarily the abdicated solutions. Because, again, this is from 2013, democracy, taking on terrorism, integration, defensible defense. But we'll focus, I think, on the issues here that come to mind. We'll focus on immigration and politics. So we'll start with immigration. And of course, immigration will, of course, be the determining factor. I think many of us in here would like zero immigration or net, repatriation or immigration out of the country. Immigration is another realm of policy that, which by its very nature spans the domestic and international. It is also one of the most divisive and controversial. Efforts to pass legislation that would reform the immigration to pass, or in part or the whole, have come little more than 2 decades. How the politics of this issue will have far-reaching effects on American society, the U.S. economy, and U.S. foreign policy. The issue of immigration policy and possible reform can best be understood by separating it into 3 parts. The first and most familiar is the preventing of illegal entry. This is on one hand a national security issue. In the post-9/11 era, there's an understandable concern about people entering the United States illegally. That said, it is worth pointing out that the 9/11 attacks were committed by those that had been granted legal admission, although several overstayed their visas and or otherwise violated them. And visa overstay is one of the most largest problems of illegal immigration in the country. It is also an economic security issue, as organized labor and others have viewed illegal workers as a threat to Americans who are looking for their jobs. To fun historical fact, Cesar Chavez, who gets celebrated so much by the left for labor rights and Chicano issues with labor, was adamantly against illegal immigration for the very issue that's mentioned here of lowering wages and making it hard to look for jobs. And then, the other issue, of course, is that America has over 13 million illegal immigrants in this country. That's another problem. But the second dimension, of course, is how to resolve the status, which at the time in 2013 is 11 million or so. There are many that have advocated for reform, such as the Gang of Eight bill, DACA, trying to find amnesty or a pathway to citizenship, which, of course, has been properly decried as a simple way to garner an ushering Democratic majority. There was a tweet by Representative Swalwell of California, the guy that had been sleeping with a Chinese operative, and said, always reminder, no matter how bad the political victory looks, there are more of us than there are them. And that's a factually true statement because they keep importing them. But of course, that issue has been debated for years, not just under the Obama administration, but also under George W. Bush, Clinton. Reagan famously provided amnesty to 3 million of them, did not turn out the way that he did, merely with a thank you, but we're still going to vote for the other guy. But of course, these issues that he focuses on is about how do you take care of these problems. And since the Trump administration and running on the idea of building a wall, the fact that nowadays the political rhetoric of, say, the alt-right 1.0 is now being more openly talked about by mainstream Republicans. You can hear it from Tucker Carlson. You can hear it from virtually any right-wing thinker outside of Ben Shapiro, I think, that talks about replacement migration and the impact that has on elections, demographics being destiny. It does illustrate that until those issues get resolved, you won't have it. And the funny thing, though, about the national interest article that was being discussed was that, well, if we just bring in individuals that wish to serve the United States military and offer them the promise of citizenship, I mean, we already do that now. We already provide a pathway for citizenship for those that have are here on visa or some other form. They're married to a U.S. citizen or not earned their citizenship. They're given more leeway through military service. And of course, we see plenty of imagery and individuals, either from, say, the U.S. Military Academy, the most famous photo with a cadet with the "Communism will win" thing written into his cap, or plenty of photos of Hispanic servicemen holding the Mexican flag while in American military barracks. We're kind of already doing that already. And it does illustrate the wanting to and the readiness of armed forces, whether it is the most recent example over the issue of mandates and the armed forces, whether you are, not just a reservist, but you are active duty full time, to where it's been an effective political purging tool to many of them. Although not by all. I mean, the logic I've heard from some people that took the vaccine was that, they gave us all sorts of stuff when we went overseas in the desert. What's the difference? So for those of you who have served, your mileage may vary. I don't mean that as an insult. It's just my perspective. But then, of course, the other issue behind immigration here is the fact of what to do with it. And the third, about green cards lapsing, or H-1B visas continue to increase, primarily overwhelming the U.S. tech sector. We're more reliant on H-2B visas, of course, when it comes to our agricultural policy, which, of course, is already subsidized by numerous amounts of subsidies in our tax dollars in America. But he talks about a rating system that should be considered, the idea of something more similar to an Australian system of taking a look at those who are skilled, those that can provide. I don't think we're going to ever find a meaningful solution under the current regime here, at least until the issue of bio-Leninism resolves itself, which means either more groups trying to come up with things, more, bashing the eternal specter, dare I say, hauntology, right? The specter of whiteness in America, similar to what we see in South Africa, or perhaps similarly, just a complete overwhelming where they'll settle for your submission instead of your, decapitation, politically speaking. But, demography does matter in that regard, especially if you want to defend yourself. I think actually Eric M points out in the chat, that's something to actually keep in mind. It's just that demography matters if you do want to defend yourself or have your economy grow. So yeah, that's very true. I mean, what and this becomes the question, right? Nation states traditionally have a polity that does have a consensus of an American identity, or at least here in the US it traditionally did. Now that it's being attacked, we're now dealing with what Yarvin has described as the two-story state, what has also been described by numerous others as replacement, that if you're going to deconstruct in a postmodernist sense the idea of what came before, its history, topple statues, and things like that, you are essentially living in an occupied country. And that becomes a certain problem. I like this line. So until the issue of bio-Leninism resolves itself, so until the second coming of Christ. Probably doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and at least resolve our problems here at home. But of course, the other issue in regards to, and this is the article I wrote not too long ago on Substack that my patrons can see, is that the foreign policy of the West today really does seem to be focused on exporting its cultural divides and divisions. That way you can hamper other countries that wish to rebel against your rules-based and orders of the world. We see this most prominently with Hungary and Poland, and we've seen this in other areas that are trying to vote against new established orders. We saw this most prominently with Chile as well. They rejected the progressive constitution, which was a major defeat to the openly socialist, childless millennial President Boric. Although keep in mind that that constitution was backed by the National Endowment of Democracy and the World Economic Forum, so good for the Chileans for rejecting it. I mean, it should have, but the issue with constitutionalism that individuals like Joseph de Maistre, as well as not just de Maistre, but also Carl Schmitt has pointed out, is that constitutional frameworks can only work so well until you hit the point of exception. And unfortunately, I think that the Republic probably could have held itself for two reasons, or for maybe in three areas. One, the issue of freedom of association and by extension secession. That exception came to a head in the 1860s. We know how that ended. Two would be the ability to only maintain citizens natural born in the United States can hold office. I think that's an excellent one, because as a recent article came out from Breitbart the other day, 90% of all foreign-born politicians in America are with the Democratic Party. Kind of illustrates how the grift works. And then the third issue, I think, would be, of course, the fact that the balance of powers were never fully realized. Bertrand de Juvenel makes that abundantly clear in On Power. Academic Agent references that in his book, The Populist Delusion, is that one will inevitably try and conquer over the three and erode sovereignty of the others in order to centralize power. This is why the executive branch holds quite a bit of power, because, yes, Congress can fund things and special interests can seek influence over things, but at the same time, right, the problem that also exists is that that executive branch doesn't, like, the authority isn't really within the president. It is within its bureaucracy. We do live in a managerial state. So, you know, I'm sure you're being sarcastic. You don't like my music, but, you know, I think I would prefer my constitution being written by those people. So, but back to the text here, and then I'll provide some thoughts because we're almost near the hour mark. So I'm going to go back to that. The issue of immigration needs to be resolved, yes. And then the last one is going to be about politics. What is worth mentioning about this catalog of problems, or challenges if you prefer, is that none is insoluble and none exists because of the lack of resources or talent or ideas, rather that all are man-made, or in this case, American-made. The good news is that they can be fixed. The not-so-good news is that the same reason they exist and will make it hard to fix them is politics. Will American politics allow the United States, for more than 65 years, the principal power in the world, to continue to play that role? The answer has been anything but clear, and as the gap is widening between America's internal challenges and the capacity of the country's leaders and institutions to meet them. The biggest and most immediate threat to the United States is the growing inability of the American people and the American political system to forge and sustain policies at home that will allow the country to stay strong and meet the threats and exploit opportunities that characterize the 21st century. The preferred alternative would be for America's political leaders, mostly Congress and the executive branch, although governors and mayors have an important role to play as well, to agree on a plan for modernizing the country's infrastructure. Keep in mind this was in 2013. Reducing the deficit, improving American education, and promoting faster growth through expanded trade, increased foreign investment, and a much revised corporate tax code. This leads to a new question. Is American politics up to the challenge? We cannot rely on sanguine predictions. The country has worked its way through difficult challenges in the past and will do so again. To the contrary, all too much evidence suggests that the current political system is not willing or unable to act, be it reduce spending and popular entitlement programs or to increase taxes sufficiently, given the unpopularity of doing so. The causes are many and include the way congressional districts are drawn increasingly to make safe Democratic and safe Republican seats. This allows candidates to win without needing to appeal to centrists of either party or independents, resulting in members of Congress who increasingly play out the political game closer to one end of the zone rather than midfield. Again, what a danger to liberalism. We've allowed our own forms of extremes and grifting, which of course, if the rule led you to here, what good was the rule, as we like to think of in There Will Be Blood. Funding of politics is increasingly an individual matter thanks to the number of Supreme Court decisions. Candidates depend much less on parties to funnel resources in the directions. Political action committees of all sorts operate with little constraint, constituting them all but an unregulated shadow political financing system. The result of this makes it more difficult to forge broad coalitions and assert influence over, and much less exercise control over, radical voices. In the same way that if you decide to leave your electoral system rather vulnerable, say drop boxes and things like that, which you see in California, it allows groups like the Democratic Socialists of America to sweep up local elections in California by simply dropping off and harvesting more votes at the end of the day. So the various issues that he outlines are problems that, he thinks are problems to keep the system afloat, but are problems that the system actually perpetuates and exploits for its own gain, especially for the regime itself. So whether it's the internet, the explosion of our own forms of echo chambers and bubbles, people not living in reality, and in doing so makes it harder and harder and harder to actually govern. So, again, we're getting very classical look at America and a look at the world here as he references Federalist number 85 from the Federalist Papers and from Alexander Hamilton. The compacts which are to embrace the 13 distinct states in a common bond of amity and union must as necessarily be a compromise as many of dissimilar interests and inclinations. And even then, right, keep in mind that throughout the history of the United States, there's not really been a common and amicable unity between the states. Keep in mind, you had the Hartford Convention, which had almost New England secede from the Union at one point in time. You had also, of course, the nullification crisis. You had the wars, of course, that ranged over bleeding Kansas and slavery. And of course, 1865 killed freedom of association and killed the aspect of exit in the United States. But I think I will leave it here for these two texts, and I will sort of just stop sharing my screen for a bit, and I will come to sort of the central political thesis that comes to mind in that regard. So the article that we talked about today, especially in Foreign Affairs magazine, is a very similar reflection to his book in 2013. Almost a 10-year gap, really. He probably did write it in 2012, published it in 2013. So this 10-year gap has left him, Haas of all people, trying to have people pump the brakes, understanding that the political divide at home in the United States will really make the challenges of things working abroad are going to be a problem. Now, the issue, of course, with that problem is that even though things are intractably difficult at home, whether it is the most recent speech from the President of the United States labeling more or less 30 to 40 to 50% of the country as radical extremists that must be taken to point, the recent funding of the IRS to have a few more $1 billion, 87,000 more agents, that the consequence of this is that I think the regime knows that there are problems at home and that the answers to the problem at home are to quell it and to crush it. And that, my friends, is going to be the issue that I think we're going to see from here on out. Pluralism doesn't really work well in a democratic institution. We can see this quite abundantly with how our problems have been unable to be resolved, and that permanent states of exception have been ruled, or that you can rule not at all by ruling, period. Voting for the opposition, essentially, as Sean Weiland points out in chat, is a threat to democracy. And if you can't have opposition, then what's the point? But again, that's the point of how power is centralized in order to quell revolution and to quell perceived threats to the system. As you saw in my video about juvenile and bio-Leninism, we see this all the time, and right now this is where you're seeing the increase of the IRS, you're seeing the increase in gas prices, you're seeing the increase of the issues there that exist democratically here at home, especially when it comes to the fact that all of that is meant to squeeze out the middle class, which also happens to be your largest tax carrier and tax burden in the United States, to fund all these programs, with increasingly spending as well, which here we are. So I do think that, yes, foreign policy and how it conducts itself at home is going to be increasingly difficult, especially because, one, if you take a look at the fact that our at-home problems are also going to be international problems, because America exports its cultural issues at home. We've noticed this quite a bit when it comes to what areas of progress that we like to fund. But at the same time, I think the other issue that needs to be resolved, of course, is going to be the problem of where the managerial state goes, because quite often we see the White House contradicting what is supposed to be the head of state, to where even more anti-war and anti-interventionist leftists like Caitlin Johnstone can point it out. And the political formula is the point. What is going to be the future narrative of the country remains to be seen. There are some that are growing increasingly concerned that the GOP is probably going to be really done in this next election. And I do think that will be in one or two ways. One, either Trump does manage to get back into office, or some Republican do so, and they get to secure rather these phony victories or moral victories that will allow us to get more in the same of 2016 and the term that Trump had in his first term. Or if we get something like Gavin Newsom running for president, which he seemingly is orienting himself toward. He's been visiting Iowa. He's been visiting New Hampshire. He's been running advertisements in states like Florida to talk about freedom and to galvanize the liberal vote, which does indicate that our foreign policy is really going to go after some really intense things here. So the reason why I wanted to do this lecture in the beginning, not just because I found the article to be interesting, but also because it seems to be this moment of self-reflection from the regime. Not to say that Richard Haass is by no means an outsider. He's not someone that I would ever consider to be our guy in any way, shape, or form, especially if you sort of look him up in his track record on Wikipedia and all of his publications. But he is revealing sort of the same problems that had existed in 2013 still exist today and have actually existed for quite some time. Glow in the dark. I wholeheartedly agree with that as well. It's pretty nuts. But, that's the thing that I find to be coming very closer and closer, is that the things at home continue to get tense, which leads to more escalation abroad, which means we're going to see this cycle of diversionary politics play out. This is why I find it to be so important for us to understand these things and to understand them, because our domestic politics, our domestic cultural war, our domestic issues, in turn, are always going to be reflected by how we act abroad. Diversionary foreign policy is a very real thing. We see this all the time. The president of the United States, this administration, has gone out to Saudi Arabia. He's gone out to, most recently, he's about to go out to the G20 summit, which means we're going to see how he deals with China, and more focuses outside the issues at home. So things are going to get really, really rough. And so the real big takeaways between these two texts is that, one, this is an ongoing problem that even the regime can probably recognize. Two, the issues of what we are going back at home are also going to be the simple fact that what we've seen from our current political issues at home, whether we've seen the criminalization of political opposition, the arrest of figures, people pulling stunts, or the simple fact that if you decided to donate to someone's legal defense fund, like that firefighter in Virginia did for Kyle Rittenhouse, you'll get doxxed and fired. We are living in an era where political turmoil will just simply mean either continuously moving on with the demographics issue, or secondly, or concurrently, I should say, that, well, we can simply tax and criminalize our opposition. So we're heading closer and closer to that form of tyranny that comes after the collapse of democracy, where it is rule through anarcho-tyranny and rule by managerial elite, and the ongoing manipulation of procedural outcomes to do so. So you may not want Trump for another 4 years, but probably our alternatives are not great. Although I would like that Schedule F thing to happen for federal employees. But that is probably the end of sort of this commentary in today's lecture. Next week, well, I'll just get to the announcements then, actually. I'll talk about those announcements coming soon. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will go share screen and we will get to our announcements, because I do have quite a few things to tell you all. So yep, here we go. Slideshow. So probably not this coming Sunday, but the Sunday afterwards. I asked a few weeks ago for a name change to the Sunday stream on the accounts that I want something that's more on brand, like how Dave wanted to change his title of the Sunset stream and things like that. I have found a new title for that. And that title will, of course, be the Prudent Observations, which I was originally going to be the title of my Substack, but I thought that this would work better for the show. Observations on the world, geopolitics, international relations and theory, and the literature. So that definitely comes to my mind for what we're doing. What will most likely happen in the future, however, is that this will be on a Saturday. Just in part because my IRL on Sundays is going to get a little more intense for terms of time. So it will be on most likely Saturday in the mid-afternoon, right before I leave for Vespers. That way, for me, my Sunday can be liturgy, coffee hour, and lunch. And then I'll have some classes IRL as well that I do need to attend to. So not this Sunday, but the Sunday afterward, it will definitely do that. So we'll get to that issue as well. Next week's Sunday stream will be on a Sunday. It will just be later in the day to account for my good friend Furious Pertinax from the Pasta Posse, which means he'll be on and we'll be covering the issues ongoing between Greece and Turkey. I have been following that closely. Many people have sent me DMs and have asked me about whether I'm going to cover this issue, and we're going to talk about that as well. We've covered it a little bit in the background about Greece buying weapons and submarines from France, but now situations seem to be escalating between Turkey and Greece once more to NATO allies. So Furious and I will be talking about that next Sunday. Of course, as always, anytime that I have outside, appearances, I do have a Substack post for that, which constantly is updated about where I am, where I'm going to be interviewing, or things like that. And it's just on Substack, my Substack, theprudentialist.substack.com, called List of Outside Appearances. It will be constantly updated. So there you go. I'm also working on an appearance with Semiagog on his channel to sort of cover all the things about what's happening in Ukraine and the wars going on. There's plenty to cover, especially with the recent news about electrical infrastructure and being targeted. And our friend Jimmy Thomas, who has been doing a series of great episodes looking at it from an operational and logistical side, happening as well. So that'll be happening very soon. There'll be a patron exclusive article this Monday. So those of you who subscribe either on Subscribestar or on my Substack, you'll have access to a new article, a very lengthy essay about sort of living in flyover country and sort of the politics and culture that I see from where I live. It's one of the 5 very long essays that I'll have out in spring of this year in my essay collection. So that'll be a book coming out soon. So it's almost done, thank God. And then after that, my good friend T.R. Hudson will be on the 23rd of September, a Friday. He's the author of a good science fiction work, Automaton. We'll be talking about his writing process, the book, what he's currently working on. He's a very near and dear friend of mine. I look forward to interviewing him, and you should definitely be buying the book if you're interested. Hopefully, you'll enjoy more of that. And then this Thursday, the Digital Archipelago with Geo will be on my channel. And in the wake of today being September 11th, I think we'll be doing a stream sort of covering what it was like growing up under the George W. Bush years and the Iraq War and Afghanistan and all that. I have a lot more to say probably than Geo does, just because I grew up a military brat. My entire father's career is from like the Gulf War to the Afghan withdrawal. So, it's a very touchy personal subject as well for that as well. But it'll be a good episode because I'm sure I know my audience is older than me quite a bit, actually, according to the analytics. So it'll be interesting to hear your perspective in the chat alongside, my perspective growing up as well. So a lot more to come in the future. And of course, keep in mind on what's happening in the community tab, plenty of good stuff happening as well. And with that, we'll get to Frog of the Week. This week's Frog of the Week is the Oregon spotted frog, Rana pretosia, which actually just means glorious frog. Mainly found in Oregon, Washington, in the United States, and various parts of British Columbia. Its size does range from anywhere from 1 to 4 inches in length from snout to rear. They are usually smaller the further north you go towards British Columbia. Excuse me. And as well, but they are larger, closer and closer to Oregon and Washington. The coloration of the frog is definitely a good indicator of age. It will get lighter in its color compared to its more darker brown and greenish color when it is young alongside its spots. So when you can find its skin being much more of a lighter and lighter brown, you can typically tell that that's a very good indicator that that's a much older frog. Not to say that they are, a long-living frog. They typically live anywhere between 1 to 5 years, but there isn't a lot of data or literature really telling you what their lifespan actually is. And despite their small size, their diet consists primarily of live animal prey. They have been found to eat on minnows and other smaller vertebrates if they can, but primarily you'll see them going towards insects. However, when they are, of course, just hatching and they are loving the wonderful parts of being a tadpole and developing, they are primarily a vegetarian diet. They are far more fully webbed in their hind legs and feet than they are in the front, although in the back that makes them excellent swimmers and capable of getting out of dodge when necessary. You'll find them primarily on the ground in marshlands, wetlands, and places with running water and streams. And not so much just out and about in nature. So you'll see them closer and closer to the water. But that is this week's Frog of the Week. This is how we end every episode of the Sunday stream, or Prudent Observations as it will be in the future. Frog of the Week, of course, will stay, because sometimes these lectures can be pretty dry, can be pretty dour sometimes, looking at the world and how the theory works. So we try and lighten it up with a little bit at the end. And yes, that is the frog theme from Chrono Trigger. I am very thankful that both of the musical themes for my show are done by my good friend, Cyberpunk Internal Affairs. He's the one that has done all this fantastic work, not only for myself, but he's also done Apostolic Majesty's introduction, and he's also done Semiagog's stream introduction. So he's done quite a bit, and I'm quite thankful for it. So with that, we're getting towards the end of the stream. So we'll get to just catching up with all of you wonderful people. But before I do that, I do want to thank my top tier patrons who donate $20 or more or month on Subscribestar, including Fearless Leader, Raging Mandrill, User 4A, 5B, 5D, B5, Cowering Bugman, Preservatism, Focron, Consumer, and Hunger. These gentlemen make my life a lot easier in regards to paying for my anti-rejection medication. You guys really take care of a lot of the out-of-pocket costs. I'm incredibly thankful for that. Not to mention these guys get access to great articles, video suggestions, and Sunday stream appearances if they so choose. Hunger has been on quite a few times to talk about his home country of Lebanon. And I'm very thankful for his input and advice, as with everyone else on here, with their news and the articles they send to me. And we have a patron exclusive Discord server for the time being, as long as it exists. So if you're interested in that, I will be sure to post the link on Subscribestar once again. So with that, I'm going to just double check. And I know some of these are pretty good. The names are pretty good. But let me go check. Let's see here. Monetization. I don't know if there were any super chats came in, so I'm just going to check real quick. And if there were, I did not notice. But no worries if not. None today, so even better. We can just catch up and take a little bit of Q&A from you all. So let me go get my face on screen. Oh, okay. Let me go scroll through and hang out with you guys for a bit. We're doing pretty well. Probably got 10 or 15 minutes before we got to... I'm off for the evening and the afternoon. But yeah, I know. It's quite a different time. I noticed that people are talking about covering sort of the George W. Bush years and the era leading up to Obama. Many people enjoying Jon Stewart back then. I mean, it always, like, don't feel bad. I mean, there was that great stream that the Distributist did, sort of talking about 2000s culture and all the transgressive bands that, people liked back then, like the Decemberists and stuff. I mean, I still like them, as subversive as they are. I just think Colin Malloy has a very good set of pipes on him. But it's a good thing to keep in mind. So it'll be a fun stream, a fun episode. But it's do frogs eat Bugman? Well, we can hope one day, but I mean, right now they just eat bugs. But I think the Bugmen are putting themselves into their own situation where their lives are on some sort of subscribing, pay-as-you-go living experience, which I think is quite depressing and things like that. The other thing that I would like to shill, however, was the sort of impromptu stream that I did on Friday, sort of talking about maturity and mentorship and sort of these political movements and spheres that we talk about. And I think that would be quite a bit of things to focus on. I was actually really proud of that stream. It was, I was inspired by quite a few people. Charlemagne's great article, Millennial Woes, Radlib, Turnup, etc. I mean, we're all in a community of our peers, and I think that's really important for us to keep in mind as we look at the world. So I think that's a good thing to have as a pretty decent network now that we can enjoy. I don't get the point of Radiohead, Anglo-Ortho, and Dave are hipsters hard as far as I can tell. I mean, I don't think I could ever consider Dave or Anglo-Ortho to be hipsters. I mean, Dave is perhaps a hipster only in the fact that he really does enjoy fiddler-oriented folk music. And I do think that that's definitely something to keep in mind. So, but maybe, I'm probably a hipster in the way that I really enjoy just obscure, big, American jazz bands and orchestral, people like Russ Morgan or Al Twomby or even people like Jack Teagarden and Benny Goodman. A lot of people don't really listen to that and things like that. It's something to keep in mind. And I read the Haas piece. He's delusional to think of civics education and such will bring the country back together. Yeah, guys, that's exactly what we need, is another dose of civic nationalism. That will work this time. How well has that been working out? And I feel like when the elites are finally coming to like 2015 talking points and things like that, I mean, we're in some real trouble now, aren't we, folks? But yeah, Let's see here. But yeah, it's pretty rough. No, I've not heard any Aaron Lewis, Dave Bergeron. If you do want an extension of what I like really enjoy, it would be just an ungodly amount of Chet Baker. I listen to him a lot. I do really enjoy jazz and blues music quite a bit. His voice, especially, really, I quite enjoy. Many of his albums and his time out on live and unprovided or impromptu performances, I really do enjoy. But I can look up Aaron Lewis. Let's see what he says. He's the lead vocalist of the new metal band Stained when he released 7 studio albums. Since 2010, he has pursued a solo career in country music and debuted his EP in 2011, Town Line. Well, I guess I'm going to have to go give him a shot. I've not heard Stained before, but I can give it a listen. New metal isn't really my thing, but anytime that someone gives me something to listen to, I mean, then by all means. But, Oh, well, there you go. Well, I mean, it just depends, right? Civic nationalism wasn't even 2015. It's like 2005. I support W, but I'm ultra super not racist. Yeah, I mean, probably. But 2005 for me was a much I was a kid, not to make you feel old, but I was definitely far more invested in the 2004 election than any healthy 10-year-old should be. So there's a little you're gonna get some fun lore about me from my youth this Thursday for sure. More of that. Yeah, that's definitely the sort of civic nationalism I think about. ZZ Top or Leonard Skinner. I like both, but I guess between the two, I would say that I like Leonard Skinner more, but don't crucify me for that. That's something to keep in mind. Yeah, no, I do follow Brother Augustine's YouTube channel. I find him to be a particularly interesting character, being from a Jewish background and converting to Orthodox Christianity. I know he's taking a break from his channel right now, but I have been enjoying his Minor Prophet series, the Christology that you can find in the Minor Prophets of the Old Testament. He's definitely he's a solid lad. Plus, he's a musician, so even more props to him. 9 Inch Nails, that's a yes. Not even gonna have to worry about that. That's a hard yes for me. I'm a fan. But it happens. Well, glow in the dark. My counter to that would be is that 2004 and its political situation online and even in the media was far more centralized to places like broadcast, public radio. Yes, I mean there were forums and things that you could do about, but Facebook wasn't a thing yet. Smartphones weren't a thing yet. I really do think that the hyper acceleration of our political culture really does come in the advent of social media. I mean, President Barack Obama's 2008 election is the first one to really take advantage of Twitter and other forms of social media that were emerging at the time, MySpace, etc. So, I mean, yes, there's probably nostalgia that plays a big role into that, but I would also argue that one cannot discount in any way, shape, or form the impact that social media has had at all whatsoever. But again, I was young back then, so correct me and reprove me in mercy if I am wrong. But yeah. Let's see here. Our elites are really schizo. On one hand, they push 1 billion Americans to keep power parity with China, and on the other hand, they push a sort of depopulation. Let's see here. Well, depopulation. Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know how much I can consider Matt Iglesias an elite, other than to be sort of a random academic and such. So thank you. I mean, yeah, that's a good point, but if there was, how the distributist calls Richard Hanania, Dr. Bugman and Mr. Chad, depending on which day he tweets, I just think that Richard Hanania, or not, Matt Iglesias is just Dr. Bugman all the time. I don't think I found a solid take from him. Thank you, Winston. I know that you have a different name on Discord than you do here. You are another $20 patron. Thank you so much. I will add your name to this the wonderful slide I have up here. I'm terribly sorry. I apologize. So that will be corrected this Sunday. I'm so sorry. I don't have an element one yet. I'm currently setting that up, and Charlemagne has been helping me. So as soon as I have an element server through Matrix and things like that set up, I will have that available as well. So that will definitely come in mind. But thank you, Winston Fujimori. I apologize. But yes, once I get into Element and things like that, I will have that available. But for those that are patrons, there's access to the Discord server, and that's the next thing that I should announce is that this Saturday we'll be reviewing Robert Filmer's Patriarcha, just the first essay of the entire complete works from Imperium Press by Robert Filmer. So if you would like to get in on that, I will put a link in the description on Subscribestar, as well as the patron Discord where we're organizing and scheduling things. But it will be this Saturday at 12 p.m. Eastern. So if you are a patron or a paying channel member, then you will have access to it. So things to keep in mind. We do book clubs, we do private articles and reviews of things. I will sometimes review crazy foreign policy articles that I see on Foreign Affairs, and I will just read them and review them and laugh or take away some key insights. And those are all patron exclusives on top of that. So, those are things that I'm currently working on, and I'm now currently reading chat. I don't think I even dare want to put that up on screen. Kai Mokata, I don't think that would ever happen. So good luck. Good luck. So I've been following the recent territorial gains from the Ukrainians today and the recent response from the Russians on striking critical electricity infrastructure right before fall and winter. I don't know if that means that they're losing, but I'm going to operate on a 3-day rule, and I need to still keep doing more research. I haven't really done a day-by-day of the war. Others have, and I'm reliant on them. And so I will keep paying attention to various sources, both Western and Russian, to sort of get a clear head of it. They have been making advances, but who knows? There are some that have compared this to a sort of Ardennes-like offensive, making World War II comparisons. But again, let me do some more research Tuesday, and maybe I can give a much more objective opinion then. I'll probably be doing that more for sure in regards to what's the word I'm looking for? I'll be talking about that with Semyagog, I think, this week. So no worries there on that end. Yeah. You're probably right, Kai Makata. It probably would be in the thousands. And then let's see here. You don't even need to read Patriarcha to agree with it. Locke's rebuttal was so bad, I kind of agree with Filmer on principle. Yeah, this is, they don't really teach you that when you get a normal political science education. This is that, you read Locke's 2 treatises on government, and it's like, well, who's he replying to? He's replying to this, like, Robert Filmer guy about, like, the divine right of kings or whatever. And then, like, you never actually get to read Patriarcha in college, and you're reliant on obscure right-wing book publishers to give you the full sense of the argument. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. I probably happens. Well, it's not that this is why I've done a few updates, but the thing that I've made it very clear in my times talking about the conflict, Glow in the Dark, has been primarily oriented around things that I can sort of provide an objective measure to. So second order consequences, things like, the issues over wheat, the economic fallout, energy, sanctions, etc., the geopolitical backings of how that works in our relationship to India, with instance the Quad, but also the fact that India enjoys cheap Russian gas and oil alongside cheap weapons. So those are things to sort of keep in mind. I can't really do say a daily update, but I think that I should be doing more regular updates. But I am doing one with Semyagog and Jimmy Thomas this week as well. Those are things to keep in mind. I was reading the second treatise while I was on hold with my bank for 45 minutes, so I was getting angry at 2 stupid things simultaneously. Well, there you go. Definitely something to keep in mind. And you're right. Yeah, that's the biggest reason why I haven't done any sort of day-to-day reporting or anything like that. One, I'm not on the ground, so I really can't tell you what on earth is going on. I live in flyover country. And then secondly, I just, the fog of war and propaganda from all outlets and all outsides makes it very difficult to discern what is actually happening. So I do rely on others that can provide more comprehensive stuff, or those that are actually near the area or in the country to report on it. And even then, I have to take their perspective alongside everything else that I read. Big reason why I haven't done it. But all right, well, we're past the hour and a half mark here, ladies and gentlemen. I'm probably going to wrap up here. So do pay attention, of course, to the community tab, Twitter, Telegram, and there'll be plenty more to come in the future. That article will be out for patrons and paying Substack subscribers tomorrow. And if you haven't, there's already a good fishing video already out for you on the attention economy, and a good discussion on political maturity and mentorship from this Friday night. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you all have a blessed Sunday. I will see you all next Sunday before we move to Saturday. And with that, I bid you all farewell. Take care.